Well, we're the top of the hour, so welcome to this meeting of the Professional Statisticians Forum, a meeting sponsored by the Royal Statistical Society. Just to introduce who I am, I'm Stephen Pike. I'm the chair of the Professional Affairs Committee of the Royal Statistical Society's Professional Statisticians Forum. I have the great pleasure to introduce our speaker. So as I hope you know, Craig Mallinckrodt is our speaker today. Craig received his PhD in 1993 from Colorado State University, and he stayed there for around 5 years working in the Department of Statistics and the Department of Clinical Sciences before joining Lilly in 1998. He's been with Lilly ever since, and I think his name is sufficiently well known and his area of expertise sufficiently well known that I'm sure for many of you on the audience today, you'll know rather a lot about him and what he's done. But in brief, his areas of interest are obviously in clinical development, but particularly aspects of missing data. And among his many honors and credits, he's led expert teams organized by PhRMA, the industry body for pharmaceuticals, as well as the DIA Science Working Group on the topic of missing data. He's with us today, though, I guess, particularly because he was also the 2014 winner of the Joint Royal Statistical Society Pharmaceutical Statisticians Statisticians in the Pharmaceutical Industry Award for Statistical Excellence for his work in missing data. And I would encourage you, if you aren't already an owner, to go and take a look and consider buying his book on the topic, Preventing and Treating Missing Data in Longitudinal Clinical Trials, which was one of the elements of the nomination for the award, which was particularly recognized. That book's published by Cambridge Books and is available from all good booksellers, as they say, including those online. So in the credits, interestingly, I had a quick look at it this morning myself on the web page, and in the credits it describes Craig as a paragon of clear writing and even clearer thinking. And so I'm sure we can look forward to a very eloquent talk today. Finally, just before I go then, you can ask questions at the end of Craig's talk, and it will be evident when we get to that moment, I'm sure. And if you have questions in the meantime, you can post them using the Q&A function. So with that, let me hand over to Craig. Great welcome to you, Craig. Delighted to have you with us. And I'm sure I'm not alone in very much looking forward to what you have to say today.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for that introduction. I am very grateful for the opportunity to speak today, and I certainly appreciate the interest from all our audience participants today. You know, in the 25 years or so that I've been working in the field of missing data, we've seen many theoretical advances and many advances in our ability to implement that theory. And these advances have fostered change in actual practice, as now in the pharmaceutical industry we've moved away from the simple and ad hoc analyses of the past, and we now focus on more principled primary analytic approaches that are buttressed by sensitivity analyses. Now, my presentation today will not be so much about those theoretical advances or the technical details of how to implement them, but rather more so about the non-technical things that were also required to bring about change in actual practice. So I'm going to start with a bit of background information, and then I'll talk about some principles of influence and change, and then we'll look at how those principles applied to some of my work in the area of missing data. And so now we're on slide 3, and please bear in mind that I've tried to be as accurate as possible in my presentation, but some of this relies on recollections, and I'm sure some of those recollections are accurate, but inevitably some are convenient too. Therefore, to some degree, this presentation probably reflects what I would like to have done or what I would do if doing it again rather than what was actually done. On slide 4, I have some acknowledgments. I've been very fortunate to have worked with many, many people who have taught me so much and been so patient and helped me throughout over the years. So this is actually a cut and paste from the acknowledgement section in the book that Steve was mentioning in my introduction. So many thanks to each and all who've been so influential in my career over the years. On slide 5, I have a motivating example of why as statisticians we need to think more than just about the technical details of our discipline. In the first half of the 19th century, about 5 in 1,000 European women died from childbirth. Now, these death rates were surprisingly much higher in specialty maternity hospitals. And a doctor by the name of Ignaz Semmelweis was interested in not only lowering the death rates overall, but understanding why the death rates were higher in the best hospitals. And he discovered that, among other things, that some of the specialty hospitals performed a lot of autopsies to understand why the women died shortly after childbirth, and in those hospitals the death rate was even higher. Semmelweis also discovered that simple hand disinfection could dramatically lower the death rates. Now, he didn't understand why, but he felt he knew that he could improve things in the field by explaining to doctors that they were actually perhaps part of the problem. And unfortunately, his findings on how to lower these childbed fever death rates were not accepted, and he was very distraught by that. In fact, he was committed to an insane asylum where he died at age 47. Only 14 days after being admitted, he was beaten to death by guards. So having the right answer really didn't do him or the field any good. He was right, but he was ineffective. And so as statisticians, we need to be more than just right. We also need to be effective in influencing others. On the next slide, we have my career path, just a little bit of background information so you can better appreciate my perspective on some of these issues. Immediately after high school in the United States, I got an associate's degree in production agriculture and went back and farmed with my family in the Midwestern United States. This was an unsuccessful business, a polite way of saying I went broke. Then I returned to college and finished my bachelor's degree in animal sciences. I got a master's and PhD in animal breeding and genetics at Colorado State University, and then began working there in the Department of Statistics, providing consultancy and assistance with researchers in the Department of Clinical Sciences. And then I moved to Eli Lilly, where I have been for the last 17 years, working in many therapeutic areas and in all phases of drug development. On slide 7, we see a little bit about my history in the field of working on missing data. Immediately after joining Lilly, I began working on some research to better understand the merits of different primary analytic approaches, in particular focusing on likelihood-based applications as opposed to the standard analysis of variance with missing data imputed by last or baseline observation carried forward. In the period of 2003 to 2008, a lot of my work focused on extending that missing data research to categorical data. Multiple imputation implementations were also researched, and some of the ideas were consolidated through my work on the pharma expert team on missing data, culminating in a consensus paper on choices of the primary analysis. In the period 2009 to present, my work is focused a lot on estimands, sensitivity analysis, and again, further consolidation of this work through my leadership in Eli Lilly's Advanced Analytics Hub for Missing Data, which I'll talk more about later, as well as the DIA Scientific Working Group. On slide 8, back to the outline, we'll now move to talking about influence and change. And on slide 9, we have some of myths about influence. And these come from a presentation by Dr. Elaine Seat, who's a professor at the University of Tennessee here in the United States. And some of the myths that she wished to debunk, and I agree with, is that influence is inherently slimy, that there's something a bit unseemly about those with lots of influence. And that's a myth. It isn't true. Another myth is that rationality is always the best way to influence people. Other myths include that influence and power are based primarily on your position or rank in the workplace. Involving others in sharing power weakens your own position is another important untruth. And lastly, first impressions and good manners are old-fashioned and no longer useful is again another myth. Moving on to slide 10, I list some of the outcomes of influence attempts, and in a moment we'll look at influence tactics and different types of influence, but by starting on influence outcomes, it sets the stage for seeing which types of influence can be the most effective. And so one outcome is that those who we're trying to influence are committed to the task at hand. They're willing and enthusiastic. And this level of commitment and engagement is certainly required for complex and difficult tasks. On the other hand, we might have a less robust outcome where, yes, those we're trying to influence are compliant, they're willing, but apathetic. They'll put out some minimal effort, and this will work for routine tasks, but the level of commitment would be insufficient for the more difficult or complex tasks. And then lastly, unfortunately, sometimes our influence attempts backfire, and actually we end up with resistance. People are opposed to the request, to the change, and they actively try to avoid it. On slide 11, I list some of the types of influence or power, and we'll describe each of these momentarily, but for now we'll just list them as legitimate power, reward, coercive power, connection, information, expert, and referent power. And on the next slide, there's different tactics listed for how we might try to implement those types of power. And again, we'll describe these in detail momentarily, but these different tactics include ingratiation, consultation, exchange, inspiration, personal appeal, pressure, logic, legitimizing, and coalition. Now on slide 13, there's a graphic that looks at, associates these different types of power with the influence tactics that you can use. And very importantly, as we start on the left-hand side of the graph, those types of power are predominantly stemming from one's position or rank. But as we move progressively further to the right of the slide, the emphasis shifts away from position and rank to more personal attributes. And so if we start at the left-hand side with legitimate power, well, and the tactic, the legitimate power tactic, really this is where the boss just tells you what to do. The boss is your superior, and they can simply tell you what needs to be done, and you need to comply. Moving over to the right, we have reward power, which the tactic is exchange. Craig, if you do something well, if you finish that big project on time, I can support you for a promotion, or you'll get a big bonus. If I do something good, I get rewarded for it. And that's, of course, very common in the workplace. But we could also have coercive power where we put pressure on people. It's kind of the opposite of reward. Instead of getting something good for having done good, here we have more threats and pressure where, Craig, if you don't do well, I couldn't possibly support you for promotion, or you're not going to get that big bonus if you don't finish this on time. Then moving further across, we have the connection or coalition power, where this might be, for example, I would say, I'm trying to influence someone and say, well, I've already conferred with Dr. Expert and she agrees with me, therefore you should agree with my proposal too. We use our allies to support our own power. And then moving further to the right, information, this is where we use rational persuasion. And as statisticians, we're certainly prone to using facts and numbers to support our position and argue logically that others should agree with us based on this rational persuasion. Now, of course, moving further to the right, if that information were to come from an expert, it would be perhaps more influential. The same information presented by a noted expert could be more impactful. But we're basically using logic and rationality to try and influence people. And then furthest over to the right, we have the reference power, where we use personal or emotional appeals, personal inspiration, to try to inspire people to move in the direction that we want them to. And then if we go to the next slide, slide 14, is the results of some social science research that Dr. Seat conducted that looks at the consequences of these different influence tactics and how often we get each one of those three outcomes of resistance, compliance, versus commitment. And so, of course, ideally, we'd want higher percentages in the commitment column. And if we sort of work our way down from top to bottom, we see that rational persuasion, something statisticians are very prone to do, really only gets a highly successful outcome about 1/4 of the time, and nearly half of the time it generates resistance. Putting pressure on people doesn't work very well at all. It certainly doesn't get their commitment and engagement, and a high percentage of the time it generates resistance. On the other hand, personal appeals can be more effective. An example of this would be, Craig, I really need your help on this. You've shown that you can do this in the past, you're an expert in this area, and we really need your help on this project. And those types of appeals can be more effective. The exchange tactic can be pretty effective too. We see sort of an even spread of results across the various outcomes, but still, for 25%, 24% of the people, it generated resistance and didn't work. Ingratiation is another tactic that had rather mixed results, and in part, ingratiation can be a little bit like the personal appeal, where you really build someone up and, you know, you're the expert, you can do it, we need your help, you're crucial to this task. And that, again, can be effective, but we still see a lot of resistance. The coalition tactic is not very effective, especially in getting committed, highly engaged work. That doesn't seem to be very effective at all. Legitimizing, where the boss just simply tells you what to do, is obviously not one that generates a lot of engagement. About a 50-50 split between resistance and the intermediate response of compliance. It's not a great way to convince people to do complex or difficult things. Now we get on down to consultation, and the picture starts to change. Consultation, you can think of it as a way of actively engaging people in the process. And so you get their thoughts and ideas on how to do things better. And so this generated a much higher level of commitment and outcome. They're more engaged in the process, they're invested in the result, and therefore more committed to the task at hand. And then at the bottom, inspirational appeal, when done correctly, can be highly influential. And here we would often try to motivate people to a higher calling, that, you know, there's something bigger than just the project itself, something bigger than us, a societal good, discovering new medicines, benefiting patients. Those sort of things tend to motivate people for complex, difficult things more than any other approach that was tested in this research. So that becomes a very important part of trying to complete complex tasks or influence large groups of people. So on slide 15, I pose a problem. You know, not many of us are really inspirational speakers or presenters. Therefore, it's difficult for us to see how we can be influential. We're not many of us able to give those podium-pounding presentations that stirs an audience into action. So what can we do about it? Well, remember that consultation was the second most effective influence tactic, and remember too that sharing power doesn't make you weaker. So you may not have to influence the entire audience. You may only have to influence one person, who in turn can be the mouthpiece to influence the audience. So you don't necessarily have to influence everybody, but you might have to find people and solicit their collaboration, and then they become the motivational speaker and can help in moving the efforts forward. Now, when we're talking about leading disruptive change, there's a graphic with some builds on the next slide that talks about if we're trying to lead some sort of important effort, complex, difficult, Well, the project requires vision, skills, incentives, resources, and an action plan. And when all those things are in place, change can result. But along the way, we might instead see confusion, anxiety, gradual change, frustration, and false starts. And we can map each one of these attributes to the outcomes to better understand what's going right and what's going wrong along this process of change. And so if we're missing vision, then there's going to be confusion because people don't know where we're headed with this project or initiative. If skills are lacking, then we can often see anxiety. People don't know that they can get the work done. They're anxious. They worry if they'll be able to be successful. When incentives are lacking, we'll often have gradual change. Things move, but slowly. If resources are lacking, we'll often see frustration. Without an action plan, we'll see many false starts and restarts. And it's important to realize that communication of all these things is important, because if communication is lacking, then it's the same as the attribute lacking itself. But when all these things are in place, then we can have effective change. Now moving on to slide 17, where I'll actually begin talking about my experiences in missing data and how some of these principles of influence and change apply. Slide 18. When I first joined Lilly, I recognized that missing data in clinical trials was a different manifestation of a problem I had worked on extensively while at Colorado State working on genetic evaluations of livestock. That key principle was that the data available for analysis was a selected subset of the whole. And so in genetic evaluations, we learned some things that really had some direct analogy to the taxonomies of missing data that were becoming prevalent in the clinical trials research. And so I had the idea that what we had done to be successful in genetic evaluations could also be applied in clinical trials. And of course others had the same idea, that moving away from analyses that required the assumption of missing completely at random to the less restrictive missing at random would be useful. But for me personally, this was the golden nugget that kind of got me rolling in the field of missing data. On slide 19, here's some of the things that I did at Lilly to help popularize some of the better methods of analyzing missing data. So first of all, I sought out more senior statisticians at Lilly for advice and support, because who said I had the right answer or a good answer anyway? Collaborating with others can make the ideas better, and they can provide support and help to influence and change. But beyond Lilly, I also sought out external collaborators, and to some degree also including those with differing views, because if you understand the criticisms of what you're trying to advocate for, you're better able to address those criticisms. And we also tried to cultivate champions to get others invested in the success of the effort. And this kind of goes back to that idea of referent power and engagement, that others have something to gain from being involved in the effort. It's not all about one person or the leader. And along the way, we were able to provide a lot of support to advise and consult and give presentations to make it easier for people to implement the newer methods we were advocating. And we tried to provide support to others who were doing research in the area, realizing that we didn't have the single best answer all to ourselves. And we tried to couch things as change being seen as a positive step forward rather than a step away from the negative old analyses, the simple and ad hoc methods. And on slide 20, I actually list here some SAS macro code, because one of the key things in popularizing the likelihood-based repeated measures approaches that we were trying to implement more broadly at the time was to make that method easy to implement. And so one of our statistical programmers came up with a easy-to-use macro, which made the new way almost as easy to implement as the old way, therefore removing some of the impediments to acceptance of the newer method. And so there's a lot of ways one can be influential in the overall process. Someone has to come up with the theory, someone has to come up with the implementation, and someone has to come up with the influence to bring about change in actual practice. It doesn't have to be one person doing all three things. And on slide 21, I talk a little bit about some of the external support. It's much the same as the internal support at Lilly, seeking out collaborators, including others with different views. Importantly, we tried to couch this as not just a statistical issue and get engagement from some of the top doctors in the various therapeutic areas. So a lot of the same things that we tried to do for internal support were also useful when moving outside of Eli Lilly and trying to influence more broadly. On slide 22, I start talking about the specific vision for the Missing Data Hub that I led at Lilly. And the vision for that group was to lower rates of and reduce the bias from missing data in order to improve inferences from trials with missing data by implementing the recommendations for the prevention and treatment of missing data that were developed by the National Academy of Sciences expert panel. The FDA commissioned this expert panel, and their report has been very influential, but many of the same things in that report were also spoken about in our pharma expert team paper and the DIA scientific working group. So there was a lot of agreement on what to do, and then the task became bringing those changes into actual practice. And at Lilly, we formed this Missing Data Hub that included a cross-functional team of about 20 members, each of whom were volunteering their time to this effort, trying to fit in amongst all their other regular project work, some additional work on missing data. Slide 23 lists the action plan. We had 3 work streams in our Missing Data Hub: prevention, treatment, and research. Treatment was basically analytic approaches. And there was a champion for each one of these sub-teams, or work streams rather, to generate greater engagement, greater leadership, getting more people involved. Within these various work streams, there were 5 work domains: developing tools, training, methods development, new research in other words, consulting, and external influence. And so this gave team members a variety of areas to become engaged. They could work in the area that best suited them, where their interests were the strongest. On slide 24, here's some of the specific influence and power tactics as they've applied to this particular effort. Since it was an all-volunteer group, I had no legitimate power. These volunteers, they did not report to me, so I had no authority over them. And also, pressure or coercion, it's been my experience, this really kills enthusiasm for volunteers. If it isn't fun, volunteers aren't going to do it. And so you can't pressure people into volunteering and achieve success. Now, reward, since I had no authority, I certainly couldn't influence their bonuses or promotions, but there's other aspects of reward, and those familiar with the Daniel Pink book Drive understand that sometimes a big reward for highly scientific workers is the freedom to create and innovate, to do things their way. And so we tried to leverage that in the Missing Data Hub, giving people the power to do things and the freedom to innovate. We did use information from myself and the expert panel report, especially in regards to providing an overall vision, but individual workers had a lot of freedom and flexibility to implement that vision. We used a lot of consultation, speaking with people, getting their thoughts on how best to do things. Because it's a diverse problem, we needed to come at it from a number of different angles, and other people's ideas were very important in bringing about some improvements. So all in all, this idea of referent power was very important to the potential success of the Missing Data Hub. On slide 25, there's a little more information here about cultivating champions through the consultation and the freedom to operate and innovate, really sharing power. Now, not everything was done the way that I really would have liked it to have been done. Sharing power does have some consequences, but the way others did it may have been better than the way I would have done it anyway, and the freedom to do their own work in their own way was very motivating. It was important for me. I really had to be patient. You know, these were all volunteers. Only a few members of the group could consistently contribute at a substantive level, and I'm a very impatient person by nature, and so it was hard for me to deal with my frustrations and impatience, realizing that the volunteers were doing the best they could, but I always wished for more and perhaps would have been better served with a greater dose of patience than what I was actually able to have at the time. On slide 26, here's some things specific to the DIA Scientific Working Group. Although our Missing Data Hub at Lilly was effective, we thought we could be more effective if we collaborated with other companies. And so the vision was to create a publicly available library of programs and supporting materials for sensitivity analyses. Now, Lilly seeded this effort with programs we had developed from the Missing Data Hub, but others quickly and enthusiastically joined, greatly expanding the program library. And if you go to missingdata.org.uk and follow the links, these programs and supporting materials are freely available. On slide 27, I have the analytic roadmap, which was kind of our vision, if you will, for what programs we wanted to develop, and we kind of used this to track our progress along the way. I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail here, but rather, as you study this diagram, I wanted to speak a minute about influencing more broadly across regulatory agencies rather than just within Eli Lilly. And of course, I'm not able to speak to this as directly as the changes that were brought about at Lilly. However, there are some things that I think are pretty important to bear in mind. So first of all, in regulatory agencies, they're not the source of innovation and change. Regulators respond to changes in the field. So if you want to change the mind of the regulators, you basically, I think, at least in the missing data world, have to change the way the field thinks about this. And so initially, companies were doing some individual research and proposing alternative analyses as part of individual development programs. And the regulators initially were not highly accepting of alternatives to the ad hoc methods that had been in vogue for a number of decades. But over time, some nice collaborations emerged between industry and academia, between different companies within the pharmaceutical industry, and of course more broadly collaborations that involved multiple companies and academia. And the ball kind of got rolling and momentum was gathered, and more people began working on similar things, replicating research. And ultimately, that National Academy of Sciences panel commissioned by FDA was very influential in consolidating many of these ideas and giving greater credibility to a lot of the specific implementations that were emerging at various companies. And so now we all agree on the key pillars of dealing with missing data, that we need to define clear objectives and maximize retention and choose a sensible primary analysis buttressed by appropriate sensitivity analyses. And ultimately, this makes for a great story of collaboration between industry, academia, and regulators. I think we can all take a fair bit of pride in how the field has changed. So I did want to have just a few discussion points to go and hit a few ideas a little more deeply. And so on slide 29, we get to some of those discussion points. It's important to bear in mind that many or most all decisions of importance at large companies are made by groups in groups, meetings, in other words. So how can we as individuals contribute? What independent ideas or solutions can each of us offer, and how do we develop those ideas and solutions? Where do the ideas come from? Simply put, how do we solve tough problems or make complex decisions? Is sitting in meetings enough? How do we find these golden nuggets, these new ideas, new approaches that can advance us in important ways? And once we've found that golden nugget, how do we influence others to bring it to practice? On the next slide, there's some builds that I think are important to bear in mind, critical skills. So with the evolving nature of our business, I think there's an increased need for statisticians to think critically and independently. We need perspective, orientation, and mindfulness. And I'll talk about each of these starting on the next slide, which is a picture of the beautiful collegiate peaks in north central Colorado with the small town of Leadville, Colorado in the near distance. I sometimes use my own pictures to remind me of important things. And this is to remind me that perspective is important. Sometimes you need to get away from the crowd to see more broadly the full picture. On the next slide, another picture of mine that I use for reference, this is about orientation. The little bump mound you see toward the left-hand side of the graphic and about halfway up is called the Wagon Mound. This is along the Santa Fe Trail in New Mexico. It was a trail the early pioneers used to travel west, typically to get to California. And it's called the Wagon Mound because it looks like the wagons that the pioneers used to travel across the prairie. And so this was a very important navigational geographic marker for the early pioneers, and the reminder to me is that when we're in complex or difficult projects, not only do we need to maintain perspective and see the big picture, we need these orienting landmarks along the way to make sure that we're still on track. On the next slide, other critical skills is to remember that meetings are a poor place to brainstorm, perhaps good for exchanging information, but not a great place to brainstorm. And multitasking might be a good way to do several routine things at once, but it's not a great way to do difficult things. We're getting at this idea of mindfulness and clear thinking now. So you can't force a good idea to pop into your head, but you can put yourself in situations where that's more likely. But even when you have the right idea, we need to remember that being right, as it was for Dr. Semmelweis, being right is not enough. On the next slide, there's some important habits. This is slide 34. How do we actually develop these critical skills? We can develop them through important habits. When I was a graduate student at Colorado State University writing many difficult statistical analysis programs, believe it or not, sometimes my programs had errors and didn't work properly. And believe it or not, I oftentimes got impatient and a bit upset when my programs didn't work. And one day, in a moment of frustration, I pushed back from the computer, stormed out of the computer lab, busted out of the doors of the building, and stomped across the courtyard toward the student center in a moment of frustration. But soon after breathing some of the fresh, clear Colorado air, I calmed down a little bit and came up with some ideas on how I might fix my program. And lo and behold, before I even got to the student center, I had the key thing in mind to help fix the program. And so a calm, relaxed, mindful approach was needed. I needed to change my perspective. I was stuck, and staring at that darn computer terminal with a frustrated attitude was never going to accomplish anything. I had to get in a calm, relaxed, mindful demeanor. Now, sometimes I find that walking my dog, I have a nice Labrador Retriever, or playing fetch with her name's Maggie, to be out in the fresh air in a beautiful place with the dog doing something relaxing can help recharge my batteries. The short breaks can help create this mindful and relaxed attitude. Even if I'm not overly frustrated at the moment, I think these things have proven useful and have helped me to think clearly and generate some good ideas. And then there's the idea that I learned from someone I had the great fortune to ski with while I lived in Colorado. This was an important executive at a large company and a very successful person, and he told me, he said, Craig, I can do 12 months worth of work in 11 months, but I can't do 12 months worth of work in 12 months. In other words, he needed his breaks. He needed to get away from it all for a while. And that's even more important today with all the ways to stay connected we have. It's harder to become unconnected, but it's still very necessary. And then on the next slide, I summarize with some final important habits, just bringing some ideas together, that we need to make time to think every day. We need to recharge our batteries. When we're trying to influence people, we need to bear in mind that the emotional part is every bit as important as the intellectual part. EQ is as important as IQ. The American President Abraham Lincoln had some quotes that I think are useful to us as statisticians in the pharmaceutical industry. The first one being that it is better to sit in silence with those around you thinking you are a fool rather than to open your mouth and prove it so. Now, the point there is to not advocate that we sit silently in meetings and not say anything. The point is that when we say something, that it should be meaningful. Simply echoing what others have said is not a contribution. Repeating often stated things is not a contribution. Save your words for when they count the most. The second quote is that if I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe. The key point being that preparation is essential. And this slide, I'm the fellow in the white hat, second to last slide, slide 36. And I run a summer fitness program for kids, and it's an all-volunteer group. It's hard to get parents involved, engaged. It's hard to get young kids enthusiastic about exercising, especially in the summertime. And so I found that the immediate and unfiltered feedback of children ages 10 to 14 provides me a great opportunity to appraise my leadership skills. The kids will tell you when you're doing good, and they'll tell you when you're doing bad. And so some experiences outside the workplace can help one to refine their skills in influence and bringing about change. And the last slide is a slide of a lunar eclipse. And I include this slide to remind me of something very important. And that is that I tend to talk on and on and on, and if I'm not careful, I'll talk all night. Therefore, this would be a good time to close my formal part of the presentation and open it up for questions from the audience. So thank you very much for your attention, and now we can take some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Craig, for that stimulating talk. As you say, now's a good time to ask your questions. You can do that by pressing *6, as it says in the bottom left of your screen if you're looking at the web-based portion of our meeting, or use the Q&A button at the top. Just to get things going, well, in fact, someone has posted a question saying, well, how can I get copies of the slides? And for those who missed the beginning of the meeting, just to restate that if you want copies of these slides, they can be downloaded from the RSS website, which is at www.rss.org.uk /PSF. PSF standing for Professional Statisticians Forum. Maybe just to get the ball rolling with a question from myself, Craig, if I may.
Sure.
Your quotes, you gave a quote from Lincoln, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts in particular on being an introvert and managing some of the issues that you were talking about. There, I think many statisticians, myself included, are introverts, and I think this notion of sitting in silence, it's a tough one to get the right balance when you're in a meeting very often. Either we overdo it or we underdo it, and you sit there thinking about that whole thing around self-censoring, and someone said it, and there's no point in me saying it, and yada, yada, yada. You'll be familiar with that, I'm sure. So welcome some thoughts on being an introvert in particular and managing that with influence. But the other piece, I guess the main thing I wanted to hear some thoughts from you on was culture. And I think, some of your slides in the middle of the presentation talking about, getting internal and external collaborators, there's something for me really important about understanding the organization you're in and how it works and what is acceptable and what will work and what won't work so well. So for instance, in my organization, we're highly decentralized. And so any sense in which we're going to mandate something and it's going to happen, forget it. That's not the culture of the organization. But of course, there are many other cultural elements as well. So yeah, welcome thoughts from that as well.
Yeah.
Culture,
yeah.
but also on being an introvert.
I'll start with the introvert part. I think it's very important to know yourself. And so simply recognizing that you are an introvert or an extrovert provides the foundation for effectiveness. If you're an introvert, you'll need to challenge yourself more to speak up. If you're an extrovert, you'll have to challenge yourself to hold back some. And so if you're an introvert and you're sitting in a meeting and you believe that you have a good idea or you think you see something others don't see, then the challenge is for you to speak up, or through preparation to, and this can be very effective if you already know what's going to be discussed, as we often do, you can cultivate a champion for the cause. I've seen many statisticians be effective by working closely with the medics on their project. And so perhaps before the meeting, the statistician and the medic get together. The statistician explains to the medic the key points and why Plan B is better than Plan A if that's the topic of discussion. And then the medic can actually become the mouthpiece. And let's face it, if given in a typical pharmaceutical company, who's going to be more influential, the statistician or the doctor? Now, this is not to say that we should always turn our good ideas over to someone else and let them champion them, but if we're really going to be influential, we have to convince people. And so we can start by trying to convince everybody in the meeting room at the same time, or we can start by having a one-on-one conversation with some key players where we use ideas like consultation and referent power to influence that individual to our line of thinking, and then together we can align and ally with each other in the meeting. The doc can do a lot of speaking, and the statistician provides some supplementary information. So that's one approach there. In regards to knowing your organization and the culture, yes, stuffing something down people's throats and mandating them to use it is not going to work. You know, that social science research that I showed where the legitimizing tactic where you simply tell people what to do, it doesn't work very well. We're scientists. And so what would be more effective rather than telling everybody at Eli Lilly they ought to analyze their data with MMRM would be to, as I was working in psychiatry at the time, some others were interested, for example, in the diabetes therapeutic area, or in oncology, analyzing quality of life outcomes. And so by working with them, engaging them, actually helping and assisting them doing their own research, you know, if MMRM is a better way to analyze data, they're going to figure that out by working in their area, so supporting their research and helping them come to the same conclusion that I had already come to would be more effective than telling people what to do. So leading them to the right answer can be more effective than telling them the right answer. Scientists, especially in diverse organizations, you know, they want to come to their own conclusion and do what's best in their area. So rather than stuffing an idea down their throat, create a situation and support them where they can travel some of the same roads you've already traveled and hopefully come at the same conclusion, or maybe they'll come at a slightly different conclusion which could even be better than your own conclusion. So, I mean, these things are not easy, and they're certainly easier to talk about than they are to actually do, but the fact that they're difficult, you know, it's important. And so bringing about change, we shouldn't expect it to be easy. We have to be prepared for long, drawn-out efforts that'll have some disappointments along the way. So those are a few thoughts towards your question, Steve.
Thanks, Craig. So we're beginning to get questions posted on using the Q&A button, but I wonder if anyone wants to ask a live question. If you do, please feel free to star 6 and ask your question. And if you do, perhaps you just introduce yourself as you begin. Okay, well, while we're waiting for people to figure out how to unmute their phones, I will just read out the question that's been posted, which is sort of on the similar theme to being an introvert, Craig. It says, I also find it difficult to intervene when people are talking. Is there a good technique to do this when I hear someone said something I disagree on or want to put my ideas forward at the right time? And that's from Cheryl.
Yeah. Well, if everybody followed Lincoln's advice, it would certainly be easier. But in many meeting cultures, what we do see is that everyone wants to be heard, and so it really is hard to get in valuable contributions. Hopefully, people who run meetings can be more effective, and that's really the job of the person chairing the meeting, but nevertheless, it won't be perfect. And so I think if you really have something important to say, you're just going to unfortunately have to be forceful and try to horn your way into the conversation. Sometimes simply raising your hand, if the meeting organizer is paying any attention at all, it's a well understood signal that you have something to say, and I would just counsel that being persistent is important, and don't give up if you've got something important to say. If all else fails, then perhaps you can get with a key player after the meeting, but to the degree possible, being prepared ahead of time and letting other people know that you have key thoughts and ideas whenever possible will be an advantage. Try your best to get your words in during the meeting, get their attention, don't give up. But if that still doesn't work, then follow up with some key players after the meeting. There's always time for a better way. Don't give up. You have to be persistent. If I would have known how much time and effort and energy it would take to be involved in the missing data effort, I may never have started. And so these things are not easy, but this is where your engagement, your personal investment becomes important. If this really is important, then you simply have to stick with it. Don't give up. Don't become frustrated. Don't be impatient. These were key things that really got in my way many times. I wasn't patient enough, and I couldn't wait to get my words in, and I became easily frustrated. Don't do that. Know yourself. Calm yourself. Just be persistent and try to get your ideas across in one manner or another. If it's truly important and if it's truly a good idea, there's always time for it. Someone will listen.
Thank you for that. So let's try again. Anybody like to ask a question? Star 6 to unmute your line. I don't know if we have a shy audience or people just struggling with their phones. Well let me try another one.
Okay.
Well, let me try another one. I know particularly it was your slide where you shared the SAS macro, which particularly struck a chord with me, and it's about making it easy for folks. And I know when I've been involved in change programs myself, this sense of putting yourself in their shoes, reaching out to the teams, to the groups who need some help, just being helpful, and being accommodating and putting yourself out goes an awful long way. And actually, that's something we can all do. It's just, it takes no great powers of eloquence or being an inspirational speaker. It's more about just thinking hard about what will it feel like to be in their shoes, what's going to make their life easier, how can I connect into that.
Yep. Understanding your audience, understanding the end user is certainly important. And, many times we think of being influential or being an agent of change, that this is glamorous. And the idea of it is glamorous, but the act of it is not glamorous. A lot of it boils down to hard work and simply thinking about the end user and meeting their needs, knowing that having the good idea alone isn't enough. And so, you know, I really think that the statistical programmer who came up with this macro had every bit as much to do with the rapid adoption and implementation of the likelihood-based repeated measures analyses that Lilly was moving toward at the time. I mean, sure, someone else might have had the idea, but you got to bring the idea to life. There's room for many contributions on many different fronts, and so you know, if you have a good idea, probably the first thing you ought to do is find a partner. Find someone else with complementary skills that are going to be necessary in bringing about the change or influence. And so again, we all have a role to play. Somebody has to be the inspirational speaker giving the big talks. I think that might have some importance along the way. But we need clever programmers to make statistical tools easy to use. We need thoughtful people writing precise documentation that makes the programs easier to understand. We need people who can communicate complex ideas in simple terms so that those who are not skilled in the discipline can appreciate the importance of this issue. And so as individual statisticians, we can figure out where our niche is, and maybe those of us who are more introverted than others can see that some of these other roles suit us better, and those who are more extroverted can take on the other roles. So the point being is we all have a role to play. There is something for us to contribute. We just have to be self-aware of our skills, our strengths, our limitations, and then we have to be vigilant and diligent in applying those skills for good purposes. And over time, this will pay big dividends. But sometimes the process can be very frustrating and discouraging along the way. And when you get to those discouraging points, that's when you need to back up and get that perspective. Take a few steps back from the problem and see the big picture. Go back to your navigational landmarks and see if you're really on the right track. And if not, make some small corrections. But if you still have the right perspective and you've maintained your orientation, but things aren't going well, then that's the time to just push on. You're on the right track. You're doing the right things. It's just going to take time. And so these ideas about perspective, orientation, and mindfulness, knowing yourself, can play a big part in helping you navigate the difficulties of large and complex tasks.
We've got a question posted from Jürgen Hummel here on the web posting. He's asking about dealing with someone in your team who's pulling in a very different direction to you, and I guess that can happen particularly where you've got strong personalities or strongly held views, strong convictions. Any thoughts on that, Craig?
Yeah, Steve. Of course, it's always great to have new ideas and new thoughts, but sometimes it's not so great. And so the real challenge becomes understanding whether the difference of opinion is reconcilable, that through further conversation that two people can come to a similar viewpoint, or whether or not the differences are unreconcilable. And in my work in missing data, I'll give it a specific example. Initially at Lilly, two camps emerged. Well, really three camps. Those who were perfectly content with last or baseline observation carried forward and didn't want to change. Then there was the likelihood-based camp and the multiple imputation camp. And those familiar with multiple imputation tended to think it was better than the likelihood-based approach. Those of the likelihood background thought that would be better than multiple imputation. And we were kind of competing against each other for a while. But by not giving up on each other and staying engaged with each other and doing some collaborative research with each other, then we were able to see that really we had a lot more in common than our differences, And ultimately, of course, we now can appreciate that really likelihood-based methodology and multiple imputation are really two sides of the same coin. One may have some slight advantages in some scenarios and vice versa, but fundamentally, we weren't really at odds. We were trying to achieve the same goal in two different ways. And so when you see these differences crop up, it's important to understand whether the differences are there because you're trying to achieve a different goal, or are you trying to take two different routes to achieve the same goal. And as much as possible, conversation, engagement, you can't ignore your critics, but you can't let them completely derail the effort. So trying to understand the other person's perspective first will oftentimes be more beneficial than trying to hammer home again and again your point of view. So I think the old saying is seek first to understand before trying to be understood can go a long way in these regards. And, I guess at the end of the day, it's possible that in some instances you're just not going to agree. Yesterday here at Eli Lilly, I was involved in some discussions that we came to the conclusion that we were simply not going to agree. There were two camps on a particular issue, and very wisely the leader of the meeting said, I judge these differences to be unreconcilable. I understand each point very clearly, and I'll make a decision and then stop the debate. These things will come up. They can be frustrating, but if you seek first to understand, you'll be at a good starting place. Then try and understand whether you have differences in opinion as to what the end goal is, or differences in opinion how to achieve the goal, and that'll help you to understand if and how the differences can be reconciled so that you can collaborate rather than get in each other's way. Again, easier said than done, likely to be frustrating and difficult, but worthwhile if the end goal is truly worthwhile.
Yeah, no, I think a lot in that I recognize from my own experience. We sort of just passed the hour, and I'm going to sort of move to close the meeting shortly. So I've got a question posted on the Q&A, but I'll again invite anyone who'd like to ask a question on the phone just to unmute and ask their question now. No? Okay. Shy audience. Well, in that case, I'll take the question that's been posted. And Judith asks about, you've used this word mindfulness a number of times in your presentation today, and she reminds us that mindfulness in meditation means to be present in the moment. And she wonders if you can elaborate more on how a statistician can be mindful at work.
To not be distracted, for one thing. And you know what, I take a lot of walks. The campus at Eli Lilly is a fairly nice campus, although it's in an urban setting. And I find that if I'm stuck on an issue and I just can't understand something, or I'm trying to put together a presentation or a talk, I need some good ideas, that I need to get up away from my desk and get into a position, a place, a situation that I find relaxing and calming. And walking outside on a beautiful day is certainly one of those things. Exercising is sometimes an opportunity to give some perhaps even subconscious thought, but to get away from the grind of big corporations and large offices with lots of people and lots of activity and lots of distractions. I think mindfulness is likely to mean different things to different people. But you know for yourself what situations in which you think clearly and constructively, and in what situations you don't. And so try to put yourself in those mindful states more often than would happen just by simply going along in the flow of big corporate America. Corporate anywhere, sorry for the U.S. reference there. But essentially, corporations measure activity. not accomplishment. And so you have to sometimes get away from the grind of what's going on around you and get in a place where you can be effective in thinking. Do what works for you. I find that sitting in front of a computer terminal with a large office and many people around me coming and going in busy hallways, etc., is not conducive to productive thought. And perhaps I have an advantage having worked at Lilly nearly 20 years. Maybe it's a little easier for me to push away from my workstation and go for a walk than it would be for someone who just started 20 days ago. But nevertheless, we have to figure out what work habits are best for us. And so for me, mindfulness oftentimes means a pseudo-work environment or a non-work environment where I can be relaxed and calm and let the ideas come out, let the subconscious work. I can't sit there and say, Craig, think, come up with a good idea, come up with a good presentation. I have to calm and quiet my mind first, and then the ideas may come. They may not come. I'm not sure. It's every day is different, but I know that sitting at a busy workstation, staring at a computer terminal, the ideas will not come. So that's what I do, what works for me, but I think we each have to figure out what's most effective in our own situation.
So thanks for that, Craig. I've just seen a posted question. How do I unmute? I would like to say something. So that's raise me tape. So if you press *6, your line should be unmuted. And Jack, if there's any difficulty with that, I don't know if you can unmute from your end. That's Rosemary.
Oh, hello. I think I've unmuted.
Yes, you have.
Congratulations.
I don't actually want to ask a question, but I just want to say I logged into this meeting. I thought it was about missing data, but I've been so inspired by your talk, which is much better than a talk on missing data. So many things I've identified which I do wrong or could do better. So I just wanted to say thank you very much. It's been really, truly inspirational talk, not just for statistician, but in life, actually.
Yeah.
A way to handle people. So thank you very much.
I appreciate that comment, and the fact that technical details about missing data, the fact that those technical details were missing was not completely at random.
Well, that's a great
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosemary, for that comment. That's a great point to bring the meeting to a close. These meetings, as you've perhaps that's nicely illustrated, they are intended for professional statisticians, but they're an opportunity to highlight facets of being a professional statistician which don't perhaps always get the airing and the space for discussion and sharing of views that we are routinely able to access through more technically focused meetings, of which there are many organized by the Royal Statistical Society, but also many other professional societies for statisticians as well. And that was really the thinking behind creating this space. And if you have enjoyed today's meeting, I would certainly encourage you to take a look at our website, www.rss.org.uk/PSF, where you will find details of other events that we're organizing. And in particular, our next meeting, which I would draw to your attention, will be of particular interest to statisticians who get involved in consulting in one guise or another. So there's a meeting on the 21st of September. Same time as today, so a 2 o'clock start if you're in the UK and 9 o'clock a.m. if you're in the US and so on around the globe. And this is a global meeting. It's one of the nice things about technology that's enabled us to reach an audience beyond the shores of the UK, which is the home of the Royal Statistical Society. So with that, I'd certainly like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd particularly like to thank Craig for, I think, a very inspirational and thoughtful talk. And as I say, I think if you've been interested in today's talk and would like to refresh it, take a refresh of what was talked about, the slides can be downloaded from the same website. There will be a podcast posted very shortly. So I think with that, I'll close the call. Thank you all and wish you all a very good day. Goodbye.